I didn't believe the stories at first. Working night security at the National History Museum meant listening to a lot of nonsense. New guards getting spooked by shadows, old buildings making sounds they couldn't explain. I've been there long enough to know the difference between imagination and reality. Or at least I thought I did. That night started like any other. The museum closed at 6, the last visitors shuffled out, and silence settled in like dust. Once the lights dimmed, the place felt larger, emptier. During the day, the museum was full of noise, footsteps, voices, school groups. But at night it felt like the building was holding its breath. I made my rounds, checked the doors, nodded at the cameras, and settled into the control room to monitor the feeds. Just another shift. Near the end of the night, I began reviewing the CCTV footage, scanning through hours of stillness. When I reached the Victorian Life exhibit, something made me stop. I can explain why. Not immediately. The image on the screen looked normal at first glance. Gas lamps, cobblestone floor, stage storefronts. Then my eyes went to the mannequin standing near the window display. A tall figure dressed in period clothing, face pale and lifeless, frozen in a walking pose. It looked wrong. I rewound the footage and compared timestamps. In the earlier clip, the mannequin faced straight ahead, shoulders square. In the later one, its torso was angled slightly toward the camera. Not much, just enough that I couldn't ignore it. I leaned closer to the monitor, my reflection faintly visible in the glass. I told myself it was the camera angle. These were old systems. Glitches happened. Then the motion sensor alert chimed. The sound cut through the silence like a knife. Motion detected. Victorian Life exhibit. My stomach dropped. That exhibit was sealed after hours. No one had access, not staff, not cleaners, no one. I checked the logs. No doors opened. No alarm stripped. According to the system, nothing and no one had entered. Protocol said I had to investigate. Walking through the museum at night is nothing like walking through it during the day. The darkness feels thicker, heavier. My flashlight beams stretched across glass cases and statues, making shadows crawl along the walls. Every step echoed too loudly. I kept thinking I heard movement just ahead of me, but when I stopped, there was only silence. When I unlocked the Victorian exhibit door and stepped inside, the air felt colder. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. The mannequin stood where it always had, dressed in its old coat and hat, eyes fixed on nothing. I walked around it slowly, shining my light at the floor. No footprints, no marks, no signs anyone had touched it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was different somehow. I locked the door and returned to the control room, telling myself to forget it. But I didn't forget it, and the museum didn't let me. 2 nights later, it happened again. This time I wasn't the one on duty, but I was the one called in early. The guard who'd replaced me looked pale, hands shaking as he pointed at the monitor. He showed me the footage. I watched in silence as the camera feed jumped forward in time. The mannequin's arm, previously straight, was now bent slightly at the elbow, as if it had shifted its weight. We checked the exhibit together. Again, no evidence of tampering. Again, no alarms. Management reviewed the footage and said as little as possible, but I could see it in their faces. They didn't like this any more than we did. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. Motion sensors triggered repeatedly in the same exhibit, always between midnight and 3 a.m. Sometimes the mannequin's head appeared tilted. Other times, it seemed closer to the glass than before. Museum records confirmed it. The mannequin had moved several inches overnight. There were no fingerprints, no broken seals, no signs of forced entry. It was as if the thing repositioned itself and then froze again before anyone could catch it in the act. What disturbed me most wasn't the footage. It was the feeling. Every time I entered that exhibit, I felt it, like someone standing directly behind me. Not a vague unease, a presence. My neck would prickle, and I'd have the overwhelming urge to turn around, convinced I'd catch someone inches from my face. I never did. There was never anyone there. Just the mannequin, staring past me with its blank, painted eyes. I stopped turning my back to it. So did the others. One guard refused to enter the exhibit alone. Another requested reassignment to daytime shifts. Then one night, a veteran guard, someone who'd worked there longer than I had, quit on the spot. He walked out without finishing his shift, keys still in his hand. Later, he told management he felt watched constantly, and that the feeling followed him even after he left the building. I tried to be rational. I read about pareidolia, about how the human brain looks for patterns and faces. I told myself the mannequin was just an object. Cloth, plastic, paint. But knowing something intellectually doesn't stop your instincts from screaming when you're alone in the dark. The final night I worked there, I reviewed the cameras one last time. The Victorian exhibit feed flickered briefly, then stabilized. The mannequin was facing the camera more directly than I'd ever seen it before. I checked earlier footage from the same night. It hadn't been facing that way an hour earlier. I felt the familiar chill crawl up my spine. Slowly, unwillingly, I turned around in my chair. There was nothing behind me, but I knew, deep down, that if I had waited longer, if I had stayed, eventually there would have been. The museum removed the exhibit not long after. Officially, it was due to preservation concerns. Unofficially, 3 guards resigned, including me. To this day, I avoid museums after dark, because history doesn't always stay where you put it, and sometimes it watches back. I was hired for the quiet months, those strange, forgotten weeks after the renovation was finished, but before the museum reopened to the public. The Berlin Military Museum stood clean and polished on the outside, but inside it felt hollow, like a body waiting for its breath to return. Fresh paint covered old scars, yet the weight of history lingered in the air. I was brought in as part of a small technical team tasked with monitoring the building overnight. Our job was simple on paper: install and review audio recorders to detect vandalism or unauthorized entry while the museum remained closed. I had worked in sound analysis for years. I trusted microphones more than my own ears. Machines didn't imagine things. They didn't get nervous. They recorded exactly what existed in front of them. At least, that's what I believed when we placed the recorders inside the war gallery, a long, narrow hall lined with weapons, uniforms, and faded photographs from Germany's darkest years. The lights stayed off at night, and the exhibits were left exactly as they would be for opening day. The first few nights were uneventful. The audio logs contained nothing but silence broken by the occasional building noise, pipes expanding, distant traffic, the low hum of electrical systems. I listened through headphones in a small monitoring room, marking timestamps, checking levels, doing my job. The museum felt empty, inert, just a structure holding memories that couldn't speak for themselves. Then, on the 5th night, I noticed something strange. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sudden. It was subtle enough that I almost missed it, a soft disturbance beneath the noise floor, like breath brushing against fabric. I replayed the section again, isolating the frequencies. That's when I heard it. A whisper. Faint. Fragmented. Not clear enough to understand, but deliberate. Intentional. I froze, headphones pressed tight against my ears. I ran the clip through filters, boosting the audio without adding artifacts. The whisper grew clearer, resolving into syllables. German. Short phrases. Command-like. I felt a chill run through me, not from fear, but from recognition. The tone wasn't conversational. It was sharp, clipped, authoritative. I checked the logs immediately. No doors opened. No motion sensors triggered. No security alerts. According to every system in the building, the gallery had remained completely empty. I convinced myself it was interference. Old wiring. Nearby radio signals. Berlin is dense with electronic noise. I logged the anomaly and went home, uneasy but still rational. Machines malfunction. Audio lies when you want it to tell you the truth. The next night, the whispers returned. This time, there were more of them. They appeared at irregular intervals, sometimes minutes apart, sometimes hours. Always faint. Always male. Always speaking in the same tone. When I isolated one recording and slowed it down slightly, my stomach dropped. I understood the words now. Halt. Vorwärts. Stellung halten. Commands. Not modern German military language. Older. Sharper. The kind you hear in archival footage, barked over gunfire and marching boots. I felt a growing unease settle in my chest as I replayed the audio again and again. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't random noise. This was speech. I reported the recordings to my supervisor the following morning. He listened in silence, arms crossed, brow furrowed. When it finished, he didn't speak for a long moment. Then he told me to run interference tests. Full sweeps, radio frequencies, emergency bands, civilian transmissions. Anything that could bleed into our equipment. I did exactly that. There was nothing. No radio interference. No signal contamination. No technical explanation that fit the data. The microphones were functioning perfectly. Their placement was correct. The environment was controlled. And yet, the voices continued to appear. Always in the war gallery. Never anywhere else in the museum. As the nights passed, the recordings grew longer. Not louder, just clearer. Sometimes multiple voices overlapped, whispering over one another in urgent tones. Sometimes there was only one, speaking slowly, deliberately, as if addressing unseen men standing at attention. I began dreading my shifts, not because I feared hearing the whispers, but because I feared recognizing them. I contacted a linguistics colleague from the university, someone who specialized in historical German dialects. I didn't tell him where the recordings came from. I just asked him to listen. When he finished, his face had gone pale. "These are World War II-era field commands," he said. "Some of them are very specific. They haven't been used in decades." That night, I stayed later than usual. I sat alone in the monitoring room, lights dimmed, listening to the live feed through my headphones. The museum was completely empty. I knew that. I had walked the halls myself earlier that evening, checking doors, sealing exhibits. Still, as the hours crept past midnight, I felt as though I wasn't alone. At 1:47 a.m., the whispers began again. This time, I didn't adjust the audio. I didn't filter it or analyze it. I listened. My hands trembled as the voices filled my ears, low and urgent, speaking as if reacting to something unfolding in real time. I imagined soldiers standing in the dark gallery, uniforms faded, faces unseen, reliving orders they never stopped obeying. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. In their place, there was silence so deep it felt oppressive. Then, very faintly, I heard something else. Breathing. I ripped the headphones off and stood up, heart pounding. The room around me was empty. The monitors showed nothing but still corridors and lifeless exhibits. I checked the logs again. No movement. No entries. Nothing. I didn't sleep that morning. Within a week, higher authorities became involved. The recordings were reviewed by specialists, then quietly archived. We were instructed not to discuss them, not to speculate, not to release the audio publicly. Officially, the explanation remained unidentified environmental noise. Unofficially, no one wanted to listen to the files anymore. The museum reopened months later. Visitors walked through the war gallery every day, unaware of what was captured there in the dark. The audio recorders were removed. The equipment reassigned. The files sealed away. I kept a copy for myself. I don't listen to it often, but when I do, I'm reminded of something I learned during those nights in Berlin. History doesn't always rest quietly. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it remembers its orders. And sometimes, long after the soldiers are gone, the commands remain. I never expected to be alone with the museum's dead. When the unrest began in 2011, everything shut down quickly, too quickly. One day we were cataloging artifacts and planning new exhibits, and the next we were sealing doors, shutting off lights, and leaving centuries of history behind us. I was one of the junior curators at the Museum of Antiquities, responsible for documentation and preservation records. When the order came to evacuate, we did what we could, locked what we couldn't move, and left the rest to silence. For months, the museum stood abandoned. When stability finally returned, a small team was sent back to assess damage. I volunteered immediately. I told myself it was duty, professionalism, but the truth was simpler. I needed to see it again. I needed to know that the artifacts were still there, unchanged, unmoved, sleeping the way history was supposed to sleep. The moment I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The air was stale, heavy, as if the building itself had been holding its breath. Dust coated the floors. Emergency lights cast long, uneven shadows down corridors that once bustled with visitors. The Egyptian wing was at the far end of the museum, sealed behind reinforced doors. That wing housed burial masks, sarcophagus fragments, funerary texts, objects meant for the dead, not the living. Before entering, we reviewed the security footage. That was my mistake. At first, the recordings showed nothing unusual. Empty halls, darkness broken only by the dim glow of backup lighting. Then one of the technicians paused the footage and leaned closer to the screen. He rewound it slowly, frame by frame. I watched as a shadow appeared on the wall of the Egyptian corridor. It had no source. The shadow was human-shaped, head, shoulders, arms, but there was no body casting it. No movement behind it. No light shift that explained it. It slid along the wall smoothly, deliberately, as if walking. When it reached the end of the corridor, it didn't fade. It turned. I felt my mouth go dry. The footage timestamp showed 2:13 a.m. motion sensors hadn't triggered. No doors opened. The shadow passed directly in front of sealed display cases containing burial artifacts and vanished near the hall of ritual offerings. Then the corridor returned to stillness. We all stared at the screen in silence. Someone suggested it was a trick of light. Another said dust. Another said stress. Months of fear and exhaustion playing with perception. Museum studies had long noted that Egyptian artifacts were frequently linked to reported paranormal experiences, often explained as psychological responses to cultural expectation. I clung to that explanation. I needed to. Then we found more footage. Different nights. Same corridor. Same shadow. Always near the burial artifacts. Despite every instinct screaming at me not to, I insisted on entering the Egyptian wing myself. I told the team that reviewing footage wasn't enough. We needed to physically inspect the space. They agreed, reluctantly. I went in alone, flashlight trembling slightly in my hand, footsteps echoing far louder than they should have. The Egyptian wing felt different from the rest of the museum. Colder. Not in temperature, something deeper. The air felt thick, almost resistant, as if walking through memory instead of space. My light passed over hieroglyphs carved thousands of years ago, painted coffins sealed long before this building existed. As I walked, I noticed something unsettling. My shadow didn't behave normally. It stretched too long, clinging to the walls even when I moved my light away. At one point, I stopped completely. My shadow did not. It continued forward for a fraction of a second before snapping back into place. I laughed nervously, the sound swallowed by the corridor. Stress, I told myself. Fear. The mind fills in gaps when surrounded by symbols of death. I kept walking. When I reached the hall of ritual offerings, my flashlight flickered. That was when I felt it. Not a presence, not exactly. More like awareness. The sensation that something had noticed me. My skin prickled, every instinct screaming to turn around. I didn't. I was afraid of what I might see if I did. Then I saw it anyway. On the wall to my left, a shadow formed. Not mine. It rose slowly, separating itself from the darkness, taking shape as clearly as a person standing just out of sight. I watched, frozen, as it lifted one arm. My own arms were still at my sides. The shadow moved closer, its edges sharp, unnatural. There was no body, no sound, no explanation. My flashlight clattered to the floor as I ran. I didn't stop until I burst back into the main hall, gasping, heart hammering so hard I thought it would break my ribs. The others rushed toward me, shouting questions I couldn't answer. All I could do was point back toward the Egyptian wing. I saw it, I said. It's real. That night, I couldn't sleep. I replayed the footage in my mind, over and over. I researched everything: psychological projection, shadow hallucinations, neurological stress responses. I read studies suggesting that belief systems influence perception, especially around death-related artifacts. None of it explained what I saw. Shadows do not move independently. Shadows do not act with intention. Over the following weeks, the shadow appeared again on camera, always avoiding direct light, always near burial objects, never interacting with anything physical, just moving, observing, existing. The footage was classified. The museum reopened quietly. The Egyptian wing was redesigned, some artifacts relocated, others placed behind heavier barriers. Officially, the shadow was dismissed as a lighting anomaly. Unofficially, no one wanted to work that wing alone anymore. I eventually resigned. Sometimes, late at night, I think about ancient burial rituals, the belief that the soul was divided into parts, some bound to the body, others free to wander. I think about how long those artifacts sat undisturbed and what might have been awakened when we left them alone in the dark. Because shadows, I've learned, are not always empty. Sometimes they are what remains. I grew up 5 blocks from that museum, close enough that I could see its brick tower from my bedroom window. As a kid, I visited it on school trips, listened to its dusty audio tours, and barely paid attention to the stories behind the glass. By the time I was an adult, the museum had become a forgotten thing. Open only a few days a week, mostly empty, struggling to stay alive. When it finally shut down due to lack of funding, I wasn't surprised. What surprised me was being asked to go back inside after it closed for good. I worked part-time for the town council then, mostly handling records and inventory before public buildings were sold or repurposed. The museum was next on the list. My job was simple: catalog what was left, shut down any remaining systems, and prepare the building for transfer. It was supposed to take 3 nights. Quiet work, easy money. The first night went smoothly. The building felt abandoned but harmless. Dusty display cases, faded photographs, exhibits frozen in time. The lights barely worked, casting weak yellow pools across the floor. I remember thinking the place felt smaller than it had when I was a child, as if the years had drained something out of it. On the second night, the police showed up. I was in the back office when I heard the knock. Hard, urgent. 2 officers stood there, faces tight. They asked if anyone else was inside. I told them no. They exchanged a look before explaining why they were there. Neighbors had called in multiple noise complaints over the past week. Always the same thing. Always after midnight. Children laughing. Not yelling. Not crying. Laughing. Soft, distant laughter drifting from the direction of the museum. The officers searched the building room by room while I followed, flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. We found nothing. No trespassers. No animals. No broken windows. The building was sealed exactly the way I'd left it. The officers apologized for the interruption, suggested maybe the sound carried from somewhere else, and left. I tried to laugh it off. Old buildings made noise. People imagined things. Still, when midnight came, I found myself listening more closely than I should have. Nothing happened that night. The third night was different. I stayed late, later than planned, double-checking inventory lists. The silence pressed in around me. At 12:16 a.m., I stood up to leave. That's when I heard the click. It came from the main exhibition hall. A soft electronic sound, familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten. I froze, listening. Then a calm, cheerful narrator's voice filled the darkness. "Welcome to the Children's History exhibit." My blood ran cold. The audio tour device. It hadn't been used in years. I remembered it clearly. Visitors used to carry small handheld units and press numbered buttons near exhibits. That system had been discontinued long before the museum closed. I was certain I'd powered everything down on the first night. I walked slowly toward the sound, heart pounding. The hall was empty, lit only by emergency lights. On a bench near the old orphanage display sat the device, its tiny screen glowing faintly. The narration continued, describing life in the town during the 1800s, factory work, poverty, disease. Then it reached the orphanage fire. The voice grew somber, explaining how the building burned overnight, how several children were lost before help arrived. I stood there, staring at the device, every hair on my body standing on end. The narration ended. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then I heard it. A child's laugh. Soft. Breathless. Close. It wasn't distorted. It wasn't mechanical. It sounded like a real child standing just out of sight, amused by something I couldn't see. The sound lasted only a few seconds before cutting off abruptly. The device went dark. I didn't move for a long time. When I finally did, I picked up the audio unit with shaking hands. I turned it over, opened the battery compartment. Empty. No batteries. I left the building immediately. The next morning, I reported everything to the council and the police. They returned with technicians, replayed the device's internal memory, and confirmed something that made my skin crawl. The laughter was not part of the original recording. It wasn't stored anywhere in the system. It shouldn't have been possible. They tested the device repeatedly. Different batteries, different power sources, different environments. The narration played as expected. The laughter never returned. The officers asked me again about the neighbors' complaints. When I told them what time the device activated, one of them went quiet. He checked his notes. Every call had come in at the same time, 12:17 a.m. The building was sold shortly after. I never went back inside. Sometimes, late at night, when the town is quiet and the wind carries sound just right, I think I hear laughter drifting through the dark. And every time I check the clock, it's always the same minute past midnight. I didn't go looking for something supernatural. I went looking for decay. In 2018, I was part of a small group of urban researchers who documented abandoned places across southern France, factories, hospitals, schools, and once, an art museum that time had forgotten. The building sat on the edge of a quiet town, its doors chained, its windows clouded with dust and neglect. Officially, it had been closed for decades due to structural damage and lack of funding. Unofficially, no one seemed interested in saving it. That alone made it irresistible. We entered just after sunrise. Daylight softened everything. Cracked marble floors, peeling paint, empty frames. The museum felt sad, not threatening, a corpse picked clean by time. We moved room to room, photographing damage, cataloging what remained. That's when I noticed the painting. It hung alone in a side gallery, slightly crooked but intact. An unsigned portrait from the mid-1800s, judging by the style. A man seated in a chair, hands folded, eyes dark and unnervingly realistic. The brushwork was fine, careful, intimate, as if the artist had known the subject personally. I remember thinking it was strange that no one had taken it. That night, we returned with equipment. Our goal was to document temperature changes and structural movement inside the building after dark. Old buildings behave differently at night. Materials contract, air shifts, sometimes revealing hidden damage. We set up infrared cameras and motion sensors, including one directly facing the portrait. It was routine work. None of us expected anything beyond interesting data. As night fell, the temperature dropped quickly. I monitored the live infrared feed from a small control setup near the entrance. The screen showed cold blues and muted reds, walls exhaling heat into the darkness. Everything behaved as expected until the camera feed from the portrait flickered. I leaned closer. The man's eyes reflected differently in infrared. Not unusual, I told myself. Oil paints could behave strangely under temperature shifts. Still, something felt wrong. I rewound the footage and played it again. The reflection moved. Not randomly, not gradually. It shifted directionally, as if tracking something across the room. I watched the eyes glint subtly to the left, then settle. My pulse quickened. I checked the timestamp, the camera logs, the stabilization data. The camera had not moved. I called the others over. We replayed the footage frame by frame. That's when the unease set in. The reflection in the eyes changed before any corresponding change in camera position or light source. According to physics, it shouldn't have been possible. We decided to inspect the painting in person. The gallery was colder now, our breath faintly visible. The portrait looked the same as it had in daylight. Still, lifeless, just paint on canvas. I stood directly in front of it, shining a flashlight across the surface. The eyes followed nothing. They did nothing at all. Behind me, one of my colleagues whispered, "Don't stand that close." I laughed it off, but I stepped back anyway. We left the camera running overnight. At 2:34 a.m., the alert triggered. Motion detected, portrait gallery. We rushed to the monitor. The feed showed nothing moving in the room. No dust, no animals, no shadows. But the eyes were different. They were no longer reflecting straight ahead. They were angled downward, toward the camera. I felt a deep, instinctive fear then, the kind that doesn't come from logic, but from something older, the kind that tells you you're being noticed. We argued quietly about what to do next. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave immediately. Another part, the worst part, wanted to understand. We approached the gallery together this time. The air felt wrong, thick and pressurized. The building groaned softly as it cooled, each sound amplified by our silence. When we reached the portrait, I noticed something I hadn't before. The paint around the eyes was cracked differently. Not aged, strained, as if it had been pulled. We checked the canvas backing. No mechanisms. No alterations. No reflective inserts. Conservators later told us that oil paints can expand and contract with temperature, but nothing in their experience accounted for directional movement. especially not movement that appeared to anticipate camera motion. That night, the eyes shifted again, and this time, I saw it without the screen. It was subtle, just a change in sheen, a suggestion of motion, but it was enough. The eyes were no longer fixed. They were aware. I took a step back, my foot catching on broken tile. The eyes followed. I don't remember leaving the museum. I remember daylight, my hands shaking, equipment scattered in the car. Two of the others never spoke about it again. One refused to answer messages. Another disappeared entirely from our group within weeks. We never went back. The footage exists. I still have a copy, locked away, unshared. Frame by frame, it shows something that shouldn't happen, a reaction without cause, a gaze without a body. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that painting still hanging there in the dark, cooling as the temperature drops, waiting for something to look at. Because some art doesn't just capture the soul. Sometimes it keeps it. Museums are meant to protect the past, but sometimes the past doesn't want to stay quiet. Whether these events are psychological, environmental, or something far darker, one thing is certain. When museums are deserted, history doesn't sleep. If these true stories unsettled you, make sure to like, subscribe, and share. Because the most terrifying stories aren't invented. They're preserved.